good, right?
Thank you for the floor. Panel, we believe that governments exist to provide opportunity, to provide services, to provide mobility to all the citizens of whom it represents. We believe that this obligation is far greater than preserving culture, because we think that culture can and always has adapted to the different sort of lives that people within those communities live. However, if you are locked out of the services of a state, if you are not able to engage with them in a meaningful way due to inability to access them through things like language or just intense cycles of poverty, there is no access point, there is no adaptability, there is no way for you to avail of those services. That is why we think you have a principal justification for prioritizing economic development of these communities over preserving culture. I want to do a few things for you in this debate. Firstly, I'm going to tell you the sort of choices we think that this refers to. I want to talk about the comparative then. Then I'm going to bring 2 points. I'm going to talk about how we prove that this makes lives, internal lives of communities better. And secondly, how we make interaction of community with this communities, minority communities, with the state as a whole better. Before I go on, any clarifications or anything?
Yeah, so presumably there are situations where culture and economics are mutually exclusive, which is why you can't protect both in those circumstances. What are these situations that you're referring to?
Cool, yeah, that's what I said I was going to do. So we think this looks like educating individuals who speak a minority language in the majority language. So for example, educating Hispanic communities in the United States in English, educating maybe minority language speakers in West Bengal in Hindi. We think those are the sort of trade-offs we were talking about where those languages might be important to culture. We think that they continuously lock people out of accessing higher economic opportunities. We think it also looks like strictly enforcing the age at which people can finish school, because some communities have rules regarding women needing to drop out of school earlier so that they can become wives or look after a house at the age of 16, and we think that this is where the government should override those traditions and try and enforce that women stay within the education system for longer. It also looked like things like maybe a certain amount of deforestation or building over ports that were traditional fishing ports in order to build industry there that specifically has helped to employ the members of that community. What do we think, therefore, the comparative in the debate is? Because I think it would be incredibly unfair of opposition to stand up here and talk to us about how we're going to completely eradicate cultures for a number of reasons, because we think they're able to adapt, but also we think that the government has an incentive that if you can coincide economic development and preservation of culture, they will do so, and I think this debate has to operate under the assumption that that will be the case if it is possible. It is only in the circumstances where we think that tradition and culture is actively preventing entire communities or members of those communities from accessing economic goals that other people have that we would stand over. So we think the comparative that opposition have to stand over is continuously prioritizing tradition and practices of communities based on tradition, even if it is incredibly detrimental to the lives of individuals within that community in regards to the amount of economic capital that they could have. Okay, on to this first point about lives of communities. So we think that there are 3 areas in this. Firstly, we would like to just clarify that a lot is not going to change in this scenario, because a lot of times your culture stands separate to your economic policy and the job that you do. I would like to point out that this isn't the government banning days that you can have religious festivals. It's not telling them you can't celebrate them. Moreover, we think that the tradition will then adapt and continue in a new way, as we have seen with with industrialization around the world about how communities and culture can adapt. So we think opposition have to stand over preserving a static version of older culture rather than an adaptive one that can change with economic development, as we have seen around the world. Secondly, we think that small changes, such as the language of the school that you go to, can have benefits way beyond the sort of the direct programs we're talking about here. Because now if you are just educated, say for example in English if you're a Hispanic community, or in Hindi if you're a community in West Bengal, it is not just the benefits you get from now being able to access jobs. You're also able to talk to your doctor. You're also able to understand things that are proposed by the government that you might need to vote on. So we think that these are large ramifications that exist outside of economics, but are intrinsically tied to a prioritization that comes from economics. That is especially true of accessing things like higher education that you might be locked out of, especially for people that traditions and cultures tend to try and prevent, or it is traditional to not allow these individuals to access this, whether this be women or whether this be children. We think that they are an incredibly important group that need to be prioritised in this debate. And finally, we think that what is something that having economic independence allows you a choice to buy into a culture and a community. That is not the case when you are economically deprived and you have no ability to have your own financial capital so that you can move around or change the sort of circumstance that you live in. So they have to stand over having a situation that not only respects these cultures apparently, but continuously forces people and locks them into these cultures, as opposed to allowing them, say, for an example of this would be forcing a woman out of school, like we see in the travelling community in Ireland at age 16, so that they have to go and become married, whereas we think that people can still buy into that, say for example that they want to be a housewife at the age of 18 after completing their schooling. However, you have no ability to access higher education if you were originally forced out, and that's a harm they have to contend with. Before I go on to closing.
Given that these communities continue to choose to make these trade-offs and to choose their culture, what makes governments better positioned to make those choices and to value things for them?
I'm actually not even sure if that's necessarily the case, because a lot of the time we just haven't targeted resources at these individuals because of our perception that culture is what needs to be preserved. So I don't actually think this conversation is happening to the extent that they think it is, that people are choosing it. But moreover, we think that oftentimes the state does things where they prioritize things, even if we initially don't think they're in our own good, if they believe it helps us build as a community and contribute more to the state that they are running. Finally and quickly on minority community interaction with the state. Firstly, we think that the very example they talk about there, about how this hasn't been a conversation that has happened, and they haven't tried to target economic resources to override communities, has meant that you haven't got an integration between communities, minority communities and majority communities, because it is harder for you to interact and even engage with the same sort of like American dream idea of economic growth and engaging with the wider community as a whole. But we think importantly, things like crime rates are really large in say like the Inuit community or the Maori community, because of the fact that it's so deeply tied to economic degradation within those places. So we think that a lot of problems that minority communities face, like being perceived as being incredibly insular or having things like high crime rates, is because they don't have this economic advancement. We think that this is something, these external problems are also targeted when you target the economic well-being of a community. Proud to propose.
The Prime Minister, followed by the Leader of the Opposition.
I don't think you can expect opposition to defend horrible, oppressive cultures in this debate. I don't think patriarchy is a culture we're trying to protect. In the preservation of culture itself, we think preservation also involves setting rules for cultures, regulations for cultures that help preserve it in the most meaningful way possible in the longer run. We're okay with educating them. I think this debate is about a trade-off, which is when you can't give economic opportunities and support culture at the same time. And the bigger examples of this across the world, by the way, are when A, you have to choose between the money sent to preserve cultures or sent to create jobs within that certain community or geographical area. Or B, when you have to take these people out of land that they rightfully own, that they're sacred and want to be a part of, and you have to displace them and send them to a different geographical area. That's one. Second response to government case. Look, traditional people just don't want to give people economic opportunities. I think firstly, just because they're from a different culture does not make them retarded. Which is to say that almost every person of culture will want some kind of economic emancipation in life, which is to say that maybe they might not choose mainstream jobs, but they'll probably still look for economic opportunities, whether it be through rural farming, whether it be through other economic opportunities that exist. By hypothesis, that's a part of the existing status quo, which we don't have to go against. But third, like, problems within communities have been completely mischaracterized. I don't think communities are rebellious and crime prone because they don't have jobs. It's more because they feel like there's an attack on their identity. They feel like they're not a part of the state, and crime is the only resort they have to feel like their voices need to be heard. Which is why almost every terrorist group in the world is a terrorist, because they feel like there's an attack on their identity in the world, ladies and gentlemen. We're not quite sure why that's directly tied to the economic emancipation they have. So most of their case is quite unfair. We'll recharacterize the bigger debate in this situation. I'll get to this afterwards. I'll ask for it. First, what is preservation? It essentially means showing the mainstream, talking about the experiences of this culture, talking through documentaries, songs, medias, and showing and representing what these people are like. Recognize the importance of culture to these people. Some people would literally rather die than sacrifice their culture for the mainstream, which is to say their forefathers, the way they've lived, the meaning of life to them is through this culture, because it's literally all of their identity. They've lived their life through it. We think a lack of current opportunity for economic emancipation is an indicator that their identity has been historically oppressed by the majority, ladies and gentlemen. These are people who probably lived there as indigenous groups and were historically pillaged, slaved, oppressed to make economic tools for the majority to succeed. We think they have a rightful claim to their identity, and there's no arbitrary way by which you say their identity is less important than the mainstream identity, because their identity was there. By arbitrary means, just because they have less people following their identity doesn't make their identity a bad identity altogether. The fact that you destroyed their identity and used it for your own economic gain gives you a moral obligation, irrespective of the consequences, to protect that identity no matter what, because it is something that you use for your own gains and you have a right to redress. But we think the economic emancipation argument is also better served in our world. Before that, sure, closing.
So why do Amish communities refuse technological development if they really care about being economically advanced?
I think you can change that by helping them understand the trade-off doesn't have to be getting rid of Amish people altogether. You can do both at the same time. Presumably it's a slower rate of economic growth, which is a trade-off we're willing to buy. We just don't see why you have to get rid of the culture altogether, because it's your moral obligation to protect that culture. That's a trade-off I asked in my POI, they conveniently ignored. What is the trade-off when you have to get rid of culture altogether? What does this assimilation look like? Assimilation is often through changing your appearance to fit the majority, through changing your language to fit the majority, often to leave your community behind to get to the economic emancipation. This is where route to economic development for communities often fail, because assimilation is the worst way in which communities develop. Why so? First, we think most people just don't access economic opportunities even if you provide it to them, for lots of reasons. One, they feel like they're being re-oppressed, which they've been oppressed in the past, because their form of economic emancipation involves undergoing the oppression that their community has historically faced. Second, there's a feeling of disenfranchisement where they just don't feel equal. They just don't feel like they're a part of the state, which is why they're afraid to send their Muslim kids to proper mainstream schools and end up sending them to madrasas, because that's the only place they feel like their community is respected. So first reason why economic emancipation fails, some people just don't access it. Second, even the most educated individuals, best case scenario of government, are subject to discrimination post getting your economic emancipation, which is to say you're still the same skin color, you're still the same identity, you can't change the way you look, you can't change the way you, to some extent, dress. Ultimately meaning, even if these people are economically emancipated, the fact that the mainstream just doesn't understand them means the best case scenario is one when they're still second class citizens, one where they're still inferior to the rest of the society. So even if they're economically emancipated, I'm not quite sure why they'll be economically equal citizens. I'll take it later. Thirdly, the best case scenario of for community upliftment involves this individual getting emancipated, acting as a role model, and eventually giving back to that community. This doesn't work for lots of reasons, but before that, sure.
So oftentimes the reason why minority communities can't assimilate appropriately into a country is because they don't have political capital. Given that political capital is intrinsically linked to economic capital, how do we not help solve for this and give them jobs?
By hypothesis, you care about them, which is why we want to help them, which is why they probably have some political capital, which is why your prop fiat exists. Assuming there is some political capital to do this, I think there's political capital to do both at the same time, even if it's at a slower growth. I'm not quite sure how they can get away with doing things without political capital. By logic, nothing would happen if they had no political capital. We think, ladies and gentlemen, they're not going to be role models for these minorities either. Because recognize what these success stories are like. These are probably people who are distanced from the community, who are ones that are probably even the privileged groups within the minority community that exists, which is say they find it easier to assimilate, they find it easier to access the mainstream, they probably have more money to transfer geographically, they'll probably have more connections through their families to get jobs. We think these are people who are A, not likely to be the role models for the existing community that you want to uplift, and not likely to be inspirational stories of ways in which the community can look forward to developing. But B, these are also people who are unlikely to go back and redistribute the money they've earned and work for the political capital these guys talk about, because they just don't feel that affiliation with that community anymore. They're just a part of the mainstream because they've assimilated. Ultimately meaning, even if you create success stories, that's individual success stories you have, not an economic upliftment of the community overall. The comparative is, ladies and gentlemen, the status quo. We protect both at the same time. We might not be able to provide as many economic opportunities as they do, but we do it at a slower rate while protecting their identity, helping the majority understand what they are, and not historically oppressing them. We think that is the best way to go. Great, that's what it was.
Thank the Leader of the Opposition, call up the Deputy Prime Minister.
Sorry. 5 points rebuttal and then on to substantive. Okay. First thing. Oh, actually no. Piece of framing first. Like, literally look at minority communities in the world as they stand at the moment. The status quo is that minority communities are incredibly poor compared to the average population of a country. That is because of the factors that Ashling identifies that separate them from other parts of that country. For example, they isolate themselves in a community where their culture means that you don't engage with economic opportunities, where you're less likely to be educated past a certain age, where you're less likely to speak the majority language of that country, where your culture means that you feel like, where you don't engage with the mainstream culture of that country. She explains that means that there are often things like high crime rates and things like mass poverty that lead to things like drug addiction. That means that that is a cycle that continues to exist, okay? That is something that is, like, if you are somebody who grows up with a parent in jail, it is likely that the things that you are missing in your life means that you are more likely to find it hard to avoid the same thing happening to you. That's something we see happening in lower income communities in general in the world, but it's especially a problem that is happening in minority communities. That is because the policy that we currently have does not cater for their economic needs or economic development, but rather, in a vague and ignorant way, caters for their cultural needs in a way that does not mean that they can access those opportunities in the future. A little bit more on that in my speech. But first of all, let's talk about let's a few points rebuttal. Okay, first thing is they say, look, this is fine because minority communities want to find their own kind of jobs and that's better for them and they'll find economic opportunities. And first of all, they have to somehow consolidate that with the status quo, which is that minority communities are incredibly poor, incredibly unemployed compared to the average unemployment rate of a country, and generally speaking are incredibly, are very much a victim to crimes and general addiction in their communities. But second of all, Ashling in her framing literally includes being as cooperative as possible. It makes no sense to have policies as a government that are supposed to economically develop a community that don't economically develop a community. Presumably, if your policy is likely to just not make anyone want to engage with it, and no one's going to be employed, or no one's going to want a job at whatever you build, or want to participate in your education, then it doesn't work. That's a waste of your money, that's a waste of your time. It's probably in your interest to somehow make sure that includes the needs or cooperates with the community. So for example, including community leaders in developing that policy would be a good way of making sure that it is actually economically successful, which is what we have to stand over. Second of all, they say that we're destroying identity for our own economic gain. Literally, the analysis that we give you is that you are more able, as a vulnerable person in a minority community, as well as just an average member of a minority community in the world that you live in, to access opportunity if you have your own job, if you have your own money. This is a policy not about giving mainstream people jobs on the land of a sacred land of minority communities. This is a policy about giving economic opportunities to people in minority communities. That is why all of the examples that we give you are examples of how we might be able to give
further opportunity to employment, further opportunity to accessing healthcare, further opportunity to accessing other opportunities that you need in the world around you on our side of the house. Because what we have to stand over is improving the economic ability and mobility of minority communities, nothing else in this debate. Next thing, they say that that they're still looking for other opportunities anyway, but like literally where do these jobs exist? Like if unemployment rates are so high in minority communities, where are these people going to get these jobs? If the stigma is that people in minority communities are criminals and drug addicts and don't want to integrate with you and don't want to learn your language and don't want to be friendly with you, then where do they get these jobs? Like the reason why unemployment is so high is because no one wants to employ you. And the fact that those barriers exist where you don't fulfill the average milestones of the average person in your country means that you can't even get into university or you can't pursue other opportunities where employers might previously need like a certificate of education that you never got to, which means that you don't get to access those opportunities. Next thing they say is it's fine, these people want investment in documentaries and songs. Like sorry, it's just so unclear to me. Firstly, when Aisling explains to you that if you are, for example, a woman in a community that says you have to leave school or don't get to go to school in the first place, or if you are somebody who doesn't feel like your cultural or community values like actually encompass what you want in your life, but you never get to learn a language or you never get the economic opportunity to leave, why that is documentaries and songs are more important than those people being trapped in the world that they live in. But furthermore, just the fact that loads of Hispanic people living in the States at the moment can't access doctors because they don't speak English as a language is probably an important thing, probably an important consideration when we consider the actual well-being of people. Their ability to actually access opportunities that mean that they can not only build a life for themselves but also take care of their healthcare is important. I'll get to you at the end of my rebuttal. And finally, the thing of money being sent to culture versus money being sent into economic opportunities. Aisling explains to you that there is a reason why culture and tradition continues to exist regardless of government policy. Because culture and tradition has always existed regardless of government policy. The government policy in this situation doesn't necessitate the emaciation of culture, it just requires that we elevate people's economic status over giving them access to further cultural rights. That means that you can still have your religion, you can still have your songs, you can still have a language that you speak in your community, in your town hall, whatever it is. But it means that we prioritise in general government interaction and interaction with mainstream culture and interaction with mainstream development. Yeah, opening.
Yeah, so the mainstream don't understand your culture, which is why they're racist to you and don't give you jobs. So the moral solution is destroy that culture.
I'm actually going to go on to that now. Why do we create better policy when we focus on economic development versus cultural development? Status quo, when we focus on cultural development, two things happen. First of all, politicians don't understand that culture and therefore don't adequately allow for that culture. For example, the travelling community in Ireland doesn't have proper provisions for children of travellers to be able to attend schools when they move to different places. That happens for two reasons. First of all, politicians don't understand that culture, but also secondly, the stigma attached to not having money, the stigma attached to poverty in that culture means politicians have no incentive to engage with that culture. Yeah, closing.
Have cultures who have attempted to assimilate achieved the kind of economic success you're
Okay, this is not about assimilation insofar as it's about giving individual economic opportunities to cultures. That can mean educating people in business management such that they can run a shop in their own town where they're able to integrate and interact with people in their own cultures. OO tried to mech this in by being like, we can just develop cultures economically without prioritizing economic development of cultures. That's literally the prop that we're running, okay? If we can solve the way OO tell us we can solve in like just getting rid of patriarchy and other things that stop economics, but like that's literally the development or changing of culture as opposed to the support of culture. It's something we stand over on our side of the house. But why do we get better policy when we have economic policy as opposed to a policy on culture? Because generally these things are more applicable. Politicians generally understand how to economically develop someone and can generally identify where unemployment comes from, how to change that unemployment, where lack of education exists, how to educate those people. That is something that is understandable to most people, regardless of their understanding of culture. But furthermore, it also improves how they perceive minorities as being actors in the state. That means there is room for activism. That means there is room for these people becoming more prominent members of a society, more prominent and engaged members of a society. That means they can push for all the developments that I think are important in terms of having a voice. That doesn't exist on our side of the house. There is no voice for minorities. They are nothing to governments, and they are treated poorly. Please propose.
Thank the Deputy Prime Minister, call upon the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
You have one.
don't let the OG get away with this debate by telling us that it's important to teach these communities the majority language, by ensuring that these communities are better able to integrate within the culture or the country that they're residing in. We're absolutely okay with that. I think the bigger debate comes in when you're talking about a situation where you have an opportunity to preserve these cultures or go for economic development exclusively or economic development in more cases or the other. I think this looks like a world in which you don't recognize this culture as an independent, autonomous entity that requires protection and that requires awareness. That looks like a world in which these cultures are not made known to the entirety of the community, which are probably unaware of this community even existing, unaware of a separate language and a separate entity and a separate way of life existing in their own world. So this act of cultural preservation is not only to enable these individuals to practice their own culture, but it's also about making the rest of the community aware of what this culture looks like, and that is incredibly important. Why is this important? Because most of these cultures or minorities that we're talking about have been historically oppressed by the majority, and the only identity that they brand as an act or sign of perseverance is the culture that they live with. It is the unique practices, it is their individual appearances, it is the language that they speak, which they hold very true to their heart. I think it is at that point, it is important to trigger conversations about why these cultures or why these individuals have not been able to access the same opportunities as the others. I think when the OG talks about why these individuals are unemployed, we would like to posit that these individuals are unemployed because the majority perceives that these individuals come from communities which are more prone to crime, come from communities which are less able or willing to integrate. When government goes for acts of cultural preservation, it is that point of time when you talk about why crime rates are perceivably higher in these communities because of the historical oppression that has taken place. Crime rates are historically higher in these communities because of the fact that these individuals have been unwilling to learn your language because we have always perceived ourselves as cultural invaders to these individuals, and these individuals have been unwilling to cooperate, and that is dangerously problematic. We think also an ability for these cultures to survive on its own and for these individuals to access economic opportunities in a world where there is no act of cultural preservation almost always looks like a complete turnover to the other side, which means that you are only able to access these opportunities if you leave your land, if you change the language that you're speaking, if you change your appearance. And all of these things are better protected in a world where the mainstream, like all of these things, can better coexist when state sends a message that this culture is something that requires protection. Otherwise, the majority perceives that the way that these individuals can access economic opportunities by simply letting go of their cultural attributes, and we think that is incredibly problematic. But also, if you want these cultures to objectively adapt, the way that they adapt is they completely go non-existent. Is when a mass majority of these individuals don't speak a particular language, they aren't able to share their lived experiences, they aren't able to archive in their individual experiences and all of the oppression that they went through in the past. And this makes it harder for a lot of people in the next generation to access economic opportunities because the resentment towards these colonial oppressors remain, the resentment towards these individuals remain, and they are always perceived as cultural invaders and they don't integrate. I think the way that you best solve even cultures which have a particularly problematic way of life, and I think we're okay to work with these cultures. I think you're better able to work with these cultures when you are perceived as individuals who have a stake at protecting culture. If you want to change, so for instance, if you want to keep more women in colleges, if you want to make sure that more of these individuals are able to access economic opportunities, you need to make sure that you appear as a relatable figure who wants to protect that culture while giving that community economic independence. But the point of time at which there is no attempt at cultural preservation, but at the same time you go for economic opportunities exclusively, that is the point of time you are perceived as an external entity which is trying to invade that community with your own culture, and as a result and as a consequence, this community rejects that help altogether and rejects assimilation. Closing.
Doesn't this media only emphasize this difference and otherize people that should otherwise be
accepted and respected by the majority population.
Can you repeat? Sorry.
So don't you just emphasize differences and otherize these groups and make them seem like the state?
No, I think you only emphasize this difference and otherize communities when you brand these communities as non-cooperative and brand these communities as individuals who are unwilling to integrate. These communities are branded as communities which require help and better understanding of the cultural nuances and the cultural differences when you take attempts at cultural preservation and try to work with these cultures to become better. I think that happens in a world only when the mainstream is empathetic to individuals who require help in that culture, and that only happens in a world where like the vast majority of the government makes an active attempt at trying to make sure that these individuals are able to talk their own language while at the same time being able to survive. Yes?
So the majority have an incentive to engage with newly developed and wealthy communities because they can benefit from cooperation with them. Given that your own framing requires majority communities who historically just ignore cultures that aren't important to them, why do you think just investing in awareness is going to make them pay any attention?
The majority ignores these culture because the government literally takes selective individuals who have succeeded from this community and brands these governments as in brands themselves as individuals who are actually very integrative and actually very supportive to these communities. This is literally the way that Malaysian government, despite being like shit discriminatory towards Tamils who live in that area, will literally take selective Tamil figures to show the rest of the world that it's very cooperative and very integrative, whereas in reality it's not. We think these communities, as in the vast majority of these communities which need to survive, are better able to access these opportunities and are better willing to accept these role models in the first place when you create a world in which conversations actively include why these cultures are different, but at the same time your general brand of nationalism. Because at the end of the day, when countries and communities evolve, and economic opportunity is something that all communities need irrespective of where they belong, you need an active recognition of the fact that different communities require different sorts of help because of the cultural differences that reside within them. It is at that point, when you recognize these individual differences, through acts of cultural preservation, when you not only make this health accessible, but you also onboard the people who reside in these communities to partake in overall economic development, which is beneficial for everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, the Deputy Leader opposite, Alderman Vidal.
Panel, unlike OG, we actually really care about culture. We think it's the way people realize themselves and understand themselves in a changing world. But unlike OO, we don't want to preserve the worst kinds of culture, because we know that the way culture is defined right now, in the absence of widespread empowerment of people within communities, is necessarily skewed. It is patriarchal, not because of arbitrary historical reasons, but because of a lack of economic development. We think once we integrate entire economies of cultures into the broader market economy, we're able to empower the most disempowered people within these communities and influence cultures such that they become much better off. We think that's what actually gets you a mechanism of change. So that's going to be the extension that Tejal and I bring you. We're going to tell you that the way that cultures are defined right now is necessarily inegalitarian. We change that at the point at which we prioritize economic development. What we then get is cultural development as long as economic development. Before I do that, I want to deal with the few things that opposition brings you. So the first sort of problem is they give you like this really false narrative of how we're destroying cultures entirely. They don't engage with what the real comparative is. The real comparative is that you're losing culture anyway. That is to say, minority communities and indigenous communities are interacting with the market economy right now. They don't have a choice of whether or not to do this. The market economy, that is like literally capitalism, is all around you. The problem is you're engaging with market capitalism on subjugated terms. That is, you are disempowered, you don't have skills, you are not the entrepreneur, but you are the person who has to accept whatever wages you get in the informal economy. What does this mean? This means a couple of things. We think, for instance, indigenous women in Peru work as domestic helps as opposed to, sort of interacting with the market economy otherwise. We think Dalits in India, for instance, like join the underground economy and like are part of the drug trade in India in many, many cases. The problem with all these things is that culture is being lost. Two ways. Firstly, like you literally don't have an ability to you don't have like the time or the ability or like the empowerment to be able to protect your own culture. That is to say, second, for instance, you're like losing culture because like the problem is Hispanics like in America already know how to speak English because they have to work like as domestic helps in many places in America anyway. The problem is that you are interacting with the economy but on terms that you're not choosing, so you're not able to preserve your culture anyway. The question then is, in light of that, who is better able to preserve culture? Don't let opening up get away with status quo preserves culture, because clearly the trend is towards like widespread disempowerment of people. But here's the second thing that we actually deal with. We think we make interactions with minority and majority cultures a lot better. So OG gives you like this this characterization of like learning a language and being able to talk to other people, or gives you this idea of like forming documentaries about culture, and that's when people start liking you. We give you a more realistic conception. So we say, in the absence of economic empowerment, the way in which other cultures view you is necessarily otherizing. That is to say, they view you as a culture from the distant past, as a backward culture that doesn't share in the values that everyone else shares in. So for instance, when majority communities within South America tend to look at indigenous communities, they see them as relics of a pre-colonial past that no longer deal with the majority of the economy, which is like, like literally market capitalist, where people are going to jobs, etc. So you don't see this, like, you don't see these people as people who can sort of identify with you or share the same values as you. We think we necessarily change that at the point at which we assimilate them in the economy. Like, these are the people who we are giving opportunities to, jobs to. These are the people you see around you in schools and in education. So it's not just that like you're speaking to them and you know they're human. You knew they were human. You just thought that they were. You just thought like they didn't share in the same ideas of modernity and progress that you did. I'm happy to take a POI for closing.
Sure. This seems like a giant risk. You're hoping that assimilation changes the narrative on them being viewed as backwards. But if it doesn't, they're now lost culture and any semblance of
So
economic
firstly,
advantage.
again, you're not engaging with a comparative. They're losing culture right now, and it's really awful. At the least, we give them the means to be able to like empower themselves. That is to say, we give them the opportunity to be able to take loans, get into microfinance institutions, like at the least to be able to preserve culture on their own terms. But the second thing is, we're not actually destroying the kinds of culture. We don't carry the same risk. That is to say, even if there is a trade-off, we don't think that like the way culture is defined right now is in a way that helps most people. Fantastic. This brings me to my extension. Note the importance of this extension of what I'm going to do here. I'm going to tell you that the way culture is defined right now necessarily disempowers the majority of people within these cultures in the absence of economic empowerment. What that then means is that even if opposition tries to tell you that preserving culture is important, the kinds of culture that they're preserving are necessarily bad without assimilation with the economy. So note the characterization that OG gives you. They tell you that this is often about patriarchal cultures that don't offer freedom to women, for instance, or don't offer freedom to economically disempowered people. Here's the truth. They're patriarchal because of the economic disempowerment of marginalized groups. We think privileged people within these cultural groups, that is likely old male leaders, whether you're talking about like the Maori in New Zealand, or you're talking about like indigenous groups within South America, this is the same story. They get to determine what culture is. That is to say, they necessarily disempower other people in order to preserve their own privileged place in society. That does not change unless you make these cultures assimilate. How do we assimilate you into the market economy? Two ways. Firstly, you get marginalized groups holding economic power. Let me give you two examples. First is the way in which we've run like millions and millions of randomized control trials that have shown that the best way to empower minority communities is to actually give microfinance loans through to women. Like look at the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh, for instance. We think that's the way in which this sort of stuff happens, and I'm happy to take POI for more.
Minority communities confine themselves within enclaves and selectively reject opportunities even when they are made available because they deem these opportunities as cultural interventions. Why is this attitude likely to change when the government is still perceived as an entity which does not give a shit about their culture?
So firstly, that's not how the government is perceived, because they're literally like allowing people to economically empower themselves. But here's the second thing. People want opportunities. The problem is that all privileged people get to control when those opportunities are distributed or not distributed. Here's the point. Just like the act of economically empowering a community necessarily means empowering the most marginalized people, because we know economically that this is the best way of doing it. That's how money best flows within communities. These are the people who are best able to preserve their communities. But here's the second thing. You give people education, right? So for instance, look at conditional cash transfers in Balochistan, in Pakistan, or Haryana in India that have like allowed women to go to school, or like have literally given cash transfers to families to send women to school. We think these are ways of improving the economy or within these communities, or improving economic development. This necessarily happens as a result of the model, because these are the best ways of improving what the economy looks like. So what happens when people get empowered? We think you challenge hierarchies within cultures. You also lobby the state to act against like ways in which your culture oppresses you. So for instance, like we'll tell you marginalized groups within within these societies, so like women don't want child marriage to be a thing, right? You often need the state to be able to enforce laws against it. You lobby the state to enact those laws. That is, you necessarily change your own culture once you are economically and politically empowered to go to the capital to lobby your representative. Look, OG tells you that the story starts and ends with economic development. They tell you it's about healthcare, etc. We tell you that this is about changing the culture itself and realizing your place within a changing society. For those reasons, we're so happy to be on closing out.
Thank the member of government following the member of opposition.
In a debate about trade-offs, we're going to be the first team from closing opposition to accept that we don't get everything in today's debate. Instead, we're going to bring you two claims. Firstly, that even taking closing government at their best case and saying that communities are being wiped out, culture is being eroded as it is, we're going to tell you why this is the death knell to those communities and wipes out their culture in a way that's tremendously damaging. It's exactly that framing that means that this policy is so misguided. And then secondly, we're going to give you more structural reasons why they'll fail to economically empower the worst off people. First, though, a couple of things to note. On this idea of patriarchy, which we get from the entire GovBatch, note that there are either one of two things that they can claim. Either one, they're saying that the existence of patriarchy is the exact cultural element that they're going to eliminate on their side of the house, which we think opening opposition is correct to claim, is probably dubious. I don't think that the existence of like a Bill of Rights that provides women with the right to an education is something that is plausibly considered under this debate. But even if it is, we would tell you that the types of people who are likely to be most empowered on their side of the house are people who A, will likely have been the most privileged women within these communities to begin with, but B, whose success will be attributed to the intervention of a state that many people in that community will see as oppositional to their community, which is simply to say that they will not have the political capital that's necessary to help the vast majority of women who still won't be helped on their side of the house because their parents won't let them leave the home. The second option that they have is the idea that we kind of get from closing government, that it is just direct economic empowerment that's going to allow these women to succeed. Here's a second clarification I want to make. On our side, we think in the world today, there are a lot of types of economic empowerment that don't require any kinds of trade-offs that states aren't choosing to do. That there's a tremendous amount of economic disempowerment that exists within these communities simply because states don't value them very much. And so all of the ways in which they could empower communities without directly eroding their culture, where these trade-offs don't exist, they aren't choosing to make these trade-offs. We think that there is the plausible future of substantial economic empowerment that exists on both sides of the house, and opposition needed to explain to us why it's worthwhile to permanently eliminate elements of culture and elements of community in the pursuit of these things that could already happen. So just note that the trade-off is significantly more severe than they describe, because on their side of the house, once states are willing to do this, they can coerce communities into making this choice over and over and over again, because they're able to say, look, we did this once, it's something we're willing to do, and clearly it's better for you because we know what's better, and they can coerce these communities into making these trade-offs over and over again and happen substantially more. So, why do they wipe out communities? Note that the greatest barrier to cultural maintenance is intergenerational. It's the idea for younger generations that their culture is something that's going to come at the expense of their participation in broader society. This exists in the most extreme examples, like communities that are totally isolated, but it also exists in the more mundane examples, like people who might live in a community who might live in a racially segregated part of an American city, who feel as though continued participation in their community and continued existence within that community comes at the expense of their ability to participate in broader society. These things happen naturally. They happen in the fact that pop culture and the things that draw kids in are things that generally participate in the language of the majority and exist with the culture of the majority. But moreover, they exist in the latent economic pressure to give that community up and to give that culture up. What do they do on their side of the house? First, they create an obvious reason for kids and for younger generations to abandon their culture. Note that all of the opportunities that these guys provide have to, by necessity, require some amount of giving up your culture in order to participate in it. Given that that's the case, it means that younger generations are significantly more likely to do so. But note the discursive effect as well, because the discussion that surrounds their community is now going to be one that says that their culture is something that is incompatible with the most vital kinds of economic success. It's something that's been holding them back. And note that they don't get the kind of nuanced discussion that we might have gotten throughout GovBench, sort of. What they get instead is sort of the broad claim that your culture and the broad impression that your culture is something that you shouldn't want to participate in, and if you do, you're doing something that's going to hamstring you economically. Note, though, that you turn your identity into something that's a burden. One, we think that's principally totally unjustified, and we get no justification from that from GovBench, why it's reasonable to put that onto people. But moreover, we think that the direct effect is that people are going to lose out on their ability to connect to their past generations. Whether this is losing language and the ability to talk to your grandparents who might only speak that language, whether it's the ability to read these stories and understand the songs that connect you to previous generations. The most direct effect of this is that these are some of the things that are most fundamental to the human experience. Like, these are things that make life worthwhile in the vast majority of instances. We think that at the point at which you create that trade-off for people, you're likely to lose entire generations of people, because it's those younger generations that are most susceptible to doing these things full stop. No. Also note that you're going to horribly harm the people who choose not to make these trade-offs, who lose their culture without getting any economic benefits whatsoever, something that's totally ignored on GovBench. Open.
Singapore is one of the most economically developed countries in the world, and yet it is full of incredibly diverse and rich in culture groups. In what world does economic development lead to the total eradication of culture, rather than just an adaptation
Your
to
side of the house
the
is
invent of the wheel?
situations, is the cases of trade-off. And I just want to note the euphemism that we get from Open and Gov, where they say cultures transition and they turn into other things. That's a euphemism for losing your culture and it turning into something that it wasn't, that you didn't value, and that you didn't have before. Saying culture's transition is simply to say that people continue to live and continue to have some kind of culture. It isn't say it's the thing that we think is intrinsically valuable or the thing that connected you to previous generations which we think is important. Go for it.
There is a trade-off. Cultural leaders tell you right now that their culture is incompatible with the kinds of economic development you want. We push that economic development through, we force it through, and then we empower people within these communities to redefine what culture means. That's when we get no trade-off in the long run.
No. All right, first of all, it requires by necessity a trade-off in the short run, insofar as they are literally saying we are going to get rid of part of your culture and then we're going to institute something else. But the second thing to say is that this presumes that the way in which this is done is something that's going to ultimately allow people to organically find their culture. Given that opening opposition proved to you that it's likely to be the most empowered people within these communities that are going to receive these benefits, we see no reason to believe that it's going to be this kind of organic groundswell of support within these communities. Why do you fail to economically empower people? A couple of things. Firstly, you think you weaken solidarity because you weaken connections to communities. This is in the direct instances in which you are no longer participating in economic activity that exists within your community, which is simply to say you don't have the ability to hire people from your community more so because you're more integrated and so you weaken your power. The second thing to say is that you simply lose the intrinsic connections you might feel to people in your community that causes you to give back or causes you to experience solidarity. But the second thing to say is that you fracture political movement. Because currently the most powerful political movements, or powerful political narratives that exist within these communities is either one, the existence of culture and holding on to that culture, or two, the existence of economic empowerment. At the point at which the choice is forced upon people, you fracture these communities along these lines, which makes it significantly less possible for them to advocate for both things at once. You fracture these communities, make it less possible for them to advocate for themselves. Because it is tremendously important that communities continue to have access to culture, and because nobody in this debate is willing to engage in an actual trade-off between things, tremendously proud to.
Thank you, Member Rabat. Call the Government Whip.
Unfortunately, closing opposition misunderstands the argument that Ben gives to you. He told you that if you have a government that's promoting a culture, you're only going to promote culture for those who are already privileged within those societies. We tell you that economically empowering the worst off within minority cultures is the only way to allow those who are worst off to actually define cultures for themselves and de-hierarchize systems that have held them down for so long. What am I going to do in this speech? First, I'm going to respond to CO, then I'm going to respond to OO, and then talk about why we beat OG in a pretty standard order. So, first let's talk about closing opposition. First thing they tell you is that you're going to be empowering already empowered women within these societies. The problem is that Fed gave you a very direct and specific mechanism as to how you can identify where you're going to get the highest return on investment doing things like studies, like doing things like RCTs, to show you how you can empower the most marginalized women. Like there's studies that show that giving microfinance loans to women is going to give you a really, really high return on investment and actually empower people who are the worst off in societies. Note that this is a much more specific mechanism of how you get economic empowerment as compared to our opening that just says you have to go to school. We tell you that literally giving people money to start businesses and literally giving people things like conditional cash transfers is the way you get actual economic empowerment. That means that within their communities, they are given more power. Why is this especially important? We tell you that even within minority communities, there are hierarchies in terms of who gets to access political capital and who gets to access economic capital and who gets to access cultural capital. An example of this is like in hip-hop, right, where a lot of hip-hop music and dominant black music, for example, has also had this side effect where people think that it also fetishizes women or is dehumanizing to women. We think that things like empowering specific black artists or black women artists is a way that they have allowed themselves to inject and change the culture, and that is through specific economic means that give them the access to change those cultures and de-hierarchize cultures. That is the point of our extension. It is the way you get the sort of cultural change that is beneficial to those who are being eradicated already in society and already being overpowered by change. The next thing they tell you is that this culture is going to be not actually going to have a meaningful trade-off, but note that Fed already answered this when he told you in his POI that it's about who defines culture and who hierarchize culture within these minority groups. So we think that rather it's going to be much easier for you to directly identify how to empower people who are the least well off. Like note, like in an abstract cultural sense, there's really no way for you to be like, this specific documentary is going to help the least well off. If anything, it's probably likely to otherize these cultures or make people feel some sort of resentment towards those who are the least well off in societies. Like if someone sees some sort of documentary film of like body art or like huts of like indigenous societies, they think these are relics of the past, they think these are backwards cultures, and especially the ones that are the most weird or different as compared to the majority culture. Instead of making those people feel more accepted into culture, it makes them seem more different and emphasizes that difference in a way that probably also leads to tangible output from these or locking out of economic opportunities when they're not considered as something that is normative. So we think that is problematic. The next thing they say is that identity is considered a burden, so you're not going to participate in your culture. Firstly, note that there is literally no impacting given as to why it's so specifically important. Like for example, if I choose that it's important for me to learn English rather than Marathi to be able to advance myself in society, I think that's a meaningful thing that a lot of people, and specifically the least well-off in cultures, don't get access to right now. But they don't respond also to the offense that Fed gives you, which is that if the government is preserving culture, they are preserving it wrong. That is, site opposition is actively making culture worse. Why do they do that? We firstly told you that these people are likely to be well removed from society, and given the hierarchies within minority cultures, it's likely that the people who are defining these narratives are the people who are the ones that are not actually going to preserve the people who are least well off within these societies. But we secondly told you things like documentaries or media, and I'll take you in a second, is likely to misidentify these groups as otherized and misidentify these as things that you are more ashamed of and things that are more different from the majority population, especially when an elite group is defining this. We think this is likely, but sure, I'll take it.
Economic empowerment is a result of not only greater access, but also prevailing social attitudes. Assuming that all of these minority members don't reject this help, how are greater social attitudes likely to change when they're still tagged as individuals from backward cultures who are unintegrated?
Okay, so by definition, if you get a conditional cash transfer, you are literally economically empowered. You can literally buy more food on the table. You can literally afford to send your kids to school. You can literally afford to start a business. If you get a microfinance loan, you have the clearest mechanism for how you are achieving actual empowerment. But also note that this stuff, and I'll get to this when I talk about opening opposition, is actually going to allow you to be able to define your culture as something that is respectable, because you are now seen as someone that is respectable within majority society, which means that the things you value are things that majority cultures think are also important to value, which means that structural and cultural systems they talk about are better achieved on their side. The final thing I respond to from CEO is that there's going to be this solidarity and fracturing of politics. First, note that there's already fracturing within minority communities where the least well-off literally don't have access to levers of power because they're often prevented from accessing these sorts of things. And secondarily, if you get economic empowerment, then politicians want to appeal to you because they know you're major donors, they know that you're votes that are actually going to come and turn out, which means literally the mechanism to getting more political power is getting economic power, so politicians have a reason to appeal to you. That means if they try to go for and then whip this idea of like having more political or structural change, we control the mechanism to accessing that. Sure, I'll take it.
If governments on our side of the house are going to enact cultural preservation in a way that biases towards existing power structures within communities, Why won't the same thing happen when states enact policies of economic empowerment on your side?
Because we told you it's like just statistically more difficult to measure how you're going to help a specific marginalized community, especially when the culture is culture is an unclear and non-statistical phenomenon. You can literally say, I get more return on investment from helping the least well off because literally there's like a bigger difference, like a dollar goes further if someone is less well off. Like it's just like math. So it's like easy to do. Okay, opening opposition. Why did we come before that? First, they don't explain to you why documentaries help feed kids. Like the literal way to actually empower people to get through society is literally through having more money. We think that's actually going to lead to tangible change. Like note that they don't explain any impacts or why this is important in the round. Secondarily, we think it's just kind of absurd that people don't have knowledge of what minority culture is. I think often it's that people do have knowledge but don't respect that. And even if you show that, there is no reason why a documentary is going to solve that sort of thing. I think it's instead it's not going to convince people. It's going to make people less reluctant to accept these cultures. What's the imperative we told you? Vet told you, and this is what I responded to, that and important, that culture is degrading in the status quo. This is something that no one has given a response to. It means that the comparative they have to deal with is one where already culture is being locked out, and a shift to more cultural empowerment is actually going to make that worse, actively otherize those cultures. They give you no reason why that's important. But secondarily, I would just say, literally getting economic development is what allows you to enter majority society, what allows you to tangibly change cultures and tangibly change awareness. But I don't think they'll do is tell you why we put us over our OG. We think they do a decent job telling you about how like integration and stuff is important, but we give you the most literal mechanism as to how you get economic empowerment. It's not just saying you have to learn English in schools, which like might have some effects later on. It's that literally having the money to start a business when you're trading off putting $1 into a documentary versus putting $1 into literally just giving it to people in minority groups is how you get that economic empowerment. We think that's a much more direct mechanism. We also think the stuff that we told you about how culture is degrading and how they make culture worse means that if you adopt the paradigm of side opposition, you'll still be voting for closing government because they make culture much worse. We told you two things. First, economic empowerment will help the least well off within these marginalized communities and de-hierarchize those societies. And secondarily, it means that you get better culture on our side of the house as well, which means even if you care about the stuff they care about, we still win. How do you oppose?
Thank the government. We have to call the opposition with today's debate.
A simple thing from Ruben that really didn't get a lot of response. We believe that a society in which your participation in a given minority culture is actively a disadvantage is an unjust world, in which to be black or to be Hispanic or to be a member of any oppressed group makes you economically disadvantaged. But not only that, a world in which the government institutes policies on the basis that that trade-off gives you economic advantage is an unjust world. Their response to this is, but if we get economic advantage and people choose to do that, that's totally fine. I want to make something very clear. Even if we give them that they could get this economic advantage if people choose to make this cultural trade-off, the very fact that some people won't is in and of itself damning to their case. That is to say, those who are left behind, those who choose not to learn English in the schools of OG, those who choose not to accept the help that is being offered, they live in a world in which their culture is not only degraded, but the very foundations on which that society and any advantage was previously built is gone. That's damning to their case outright. Perhaps unsurprisingly, 2 points in this speech. First, on the structure of inequality, and second, a weighing and analysis of the trade-offs in this debate. So Ruben gives you the structure of inequality in their best case. He first says that it is principally unjustified to provide that choice to begin with. That is to say, at the point when you force someone to choose between two equally atrocious alternatives, that choice is in and of itself unjustified, that governments ought not and principally ought not push that forward. But perhaps more importantly, we're just going to say that some people will reject the schools that are being offered, the help that is being given. It is these people who are locked out entirely. And to be honest, they're totally screwed. Because after all the wealthy people, after all the people who could enter those schools, could learn the language, could take advantage of the microfinance loans that CG wants to pin their entire case behind, despite them really only working for a particular subset of already privileged women in these societies, these people have no access to those people who already buoyed their culture in the status quo. It is these left behind people who win us this debate outright. But second note, that given that they do economically advantage the most privileged within that culture, that is in and of itself perhaps damning to their argument that, we fix the patriarchy. Two things under this. First, note that Ruben wanted to skirt around this, but I'm just going to say it. Like, our culture's pretty fucked too. I don't think our economic advantage has necessarily done a whole lot to help out women or help out other cultures within our society. Therefore, I don't particularly think that their economics inherently leads to the destruction of the patriarchy really holds. But second, note that given that they want to use the analysis that governments make bad choices in both worlds, which we agree with, presumably they have to bite that the choices governments make with respect to who they wish to economically empower are kind of screwed in their side of the house too. The example they give for this is insane, and I want to point it out. They say that governments should take an active role in changing rap culture, because when governments prioritize certain artists and change the way that rap works, they have therefore helped out black culture. This is insane. We don't think, first of all, any such efforts would be taken kindly, but second, any such efforts would work to begin with. Far more likely, then, is that you empower the most economically advantaged within that community. This has a few pervasive impacts. First, note that we're not going to take the stance that indigenous cultures or minority cultures are inherently backwards. In fact, statistically, we're probably going to say that half of them are less patriarchal and half of them are more patriarchal. Given that that is the case, probably assimilation is a net neutral in either world. Probably then, the choices that the governments make also choose to entrench previously existing stereotypes. Note then what that does, as Ruben told you and was left largely unresponded to, is means that when people return to that society, the choices they make in terms of economic empowerment, that is to say, those who are able to access those schools, frees out a certain group. I will take opening.
Cultures around the world have always developed with things like books, fire, the wheel, and have persisted and been maintained. Why is the snapshot of culture in 2018 the one that has to be preserved, and why would this be the change that leads to the total eradication of culture, even though it hasn't been eradicated in the last couple of 100,000 years?
It has been eradicated in the last couple of 100 years. Erasure is real. It happens every single fucking day. To say that culture is adapting is a misnomer for saying that culture is disappearing. You know what? All right, here. Look, culture can and does adapt. It changes every day. The difference then, when governments choose to make an assimilatory trade-off, is instead of adapting, that culture is folding into the broader norm. It forces a trade-off between the culture that previously adapted and changed within that community and to suit the needs and wants of that community, and instead forces that culture to change to that of the broader culture. Note that then the values that underlie the changing of culture in every other circumstance, the paradigm on which it always shifted, doesn't work. There's a difference between erasure and adaptation, and hell yes it has happened to like indigenous people across America, indigenous people across the world, and like fucking Kurds when they have to like, I can give so many more examples, but I shouldn't need to. Go.
Economics dictate hierarchies within minority communities. When you de-hierarchize these communities, you need to change them to preserve them longer and make them better.
Okay, first of all, economics dictate hierarchy in our society too, like the people who can have access to wealth, because like men can talk louder, give that kind of hierarchy in ours too. It's unclear why that changes, but you know what, fine. Even if you give a bunch of microfinance loans to women, we already told you why that helps the worst off only. All right, trade-offs in this debate. I think, honestly, Ruben is the only one to give you, literally if the debate becomes culture versus economic advantage, why we still win. Three things under this. First is the size of the trade-offs. What OG needed to do is prove a significant amount of economic advantage in the way that it trades off with culture. Because the way we often think of these debates is, it has to be inherently one-to-one, whatever that means. Ruben tells you that the trade-off is not one-to-one. I'm going to look at their own examples to give you this. First, note that cultural loss from like things like deforestation is often insanely harmful for the amount of benefit it gives. That is to say, bulldozing ancestral lands for the sake of a slight amount of economic advantage, or the jobs that will be gotten, or the profit that will be plundered for that land, is not commensurate to the amount of loss, especially given that that loss is, and this is the second point of weighing, permanent. Note that the kind of erasure that they're talking about is in and of itself permanent, that once that culture is lost, it cannot be regained, that the people that have left, that the stories that have been forgotten, that the songs that have faded into oblivion can never come back. Weigh that against the inherently ephemeral nature of economic advantage in the way that it has and does shift across the world. Third point of weighing, though, which was again unresponded to, is the uniqueness argument. That is to say, if there was a way, even if it is slower, to economically advantage minority communities without the trade-off of culture, we're going to say that the trade-off of culture, given that it is permanent and given that it is large, is inherently unjust to do, because that culture is gone forever, because it can never return. Panel, this creates a structure of inequity upon which new forms of discrimination will be built. But even if it's not, the trade-off just isn't working.
Thank you, Speaker. Thank everybody for contributions across the board.